In this section, we'll look at President Herbert Hoover's reaction to the stock market crash in the beginning of the Great Depression. We'll cover the period from the stock market crash in October 1929 until the off year 1930 congressional elections. In many ways, Hoover was kind of a sad figure. He quickly saw his entire reputation ruined. Up to the Depression, his life had been an incredible success story. Coolidge had once called him a wonder boy. He was born to modest parents in Iowa in 1874, and but they died, and he ended up migrating to Oregon. He put himself through the newly established Stanford University and got a degree in mining engineering. He quickly rose in the mining industry and had a large personal fortune by the time he was in his mid-30s. He served as the head of Woodrow Wilson's Food Administration during World War I, and many people saw him as even a potential Democratic presidential candidate. Hoover, however, was beginning to have a bit of a change of a heart, and he was starting to grow a bit more philosophically conservative, and he announced that he was a Republican. Now, in time, a conservative Republican at that. He served both under Harding and Coolidge as Secretary of Commerce. We've already mentioned him as one of the very conservative architects of Coolidge's economic policies. The question then is why would such a great engineer, administrator, and expert in alleviating human suffering completely fail to provide the leadership adequate to deal with the crisis? Now, maybe part of the problem was that he was inept at politics. He'd been a great administrator, but before 1928 he'd never run for office, never held elective office. And he perhaps had become accustomed to obedience, and thus when he should have compromised and worked with Congress, he was kind of curt and unyielding. Again, probably his biggest handicap was his now firmly held belief in limited government action, his conservative views in face of the economic disaster. Hoover took office in March 1929, which proved only 7 months before the great stock market crash. Before the crash, the only area that Hoover did anything in really was in trying to help the farmer. Remember, the farmers were overproducing, driving the values down, and Hoover had promised to do something for them. Hoover presented to Congress the Agricultural Marketing Act, and he explained that it would not undermine the initiative of individual farmers, which conservatives worried about. It created a nonpartisan federal farm board, which could lend up to $500 million to groups of farmers who had formed farm cooperatives. The federal farm board also would discourage production, which then would stimulate prices, and would also buy up surplus wheat and cotton and thereby keep the prices high. The Agricultural Marketing Act and its federal farm board succeeded somewhat in stabilizing and helping farmers until 1931, when the Depression began to spread to Europe and abroad, and really there was less demand for U.S. farm exports, and at that point the federal farm board and the AMA was just not up to the crisis. Hoover's only other initiative was the Hawley-Smoot Tariff. Again, Republicans wanted higher tariffs to protect business. You can think back to Democrats lowering the tariff and Harding having raised the tariff as a Republican. Well, the Hawley-Smoot Tariff was in 1930, and it was after the Depression hit, and Hoover wanted it to enact it to protect business. And it was raising the tariff on agricultural imports by over a third. Realizing that if America passed the Hawley-Smoot Tariff, raising its tariff, that other countries would retaliate by raising their tariffs on American exports, causing a trade war and, as I've just noted, a declining international commerce. Over 1,000 members of the American Economic Association wrote to Hoover asking him to veto the tariff bill. Hoover, however, did not and signed it. And again, many economists and historians think that contributed to the depths of the Depression. Given his strong conservative beliefs, Hoover took only limited action when the stock market crash hit. Between 1929 and 1930, he met with railroad presidents and got them to promise to continue construction of railroads. He then met with banking and industry leaders and got them to promise to maintain production and not cut wages. which they agreed to do so as long as labor leaders agreed not to push for wage increases. Now, with this promise, Hoover then met with the labor leaders and got their promise not to push for the wage increases. Hoover met with governors and mayors, asking them to continue to spend money on public works. All of this voluntarism seemed at first to work. December 1929 to April 1930, surveys revealed that unemployment had rose only slightly to 3 million unemployed. Congress did help out by authorizing $145 million for river and harbor improvements, $530 million for public buildings, and another $75 million for roads, which all created jobs. More importantly, employers and leaders were apparently keeping their promise not to cut wages or lay off massive numbers of workers. But then, by May and June 1930, things began to change. Things began to go bad. Employers began to reduce production and to fire workers. Overall, leaders began to renege on their promises. Again, they had been voluntary. There had been no coercion. When unemployment reached 4 million in October 1930, Hoover appointed a Committee for Unemployment Relief. All it really did, however, was call for private industry to once again redouble their voluntary efforts. Democrats thought they had a pretty good opportunity to regain control of Congress in the off-year 1930 congressional election. And in fact, they performed well. The Republicans lost control of the House of Representatives, and they lost 8 seats in the Senate as well. Obviously, it was a harsh verdict on Hoover's policies, but I guess the party always in power always sort of loses seats. Also, the Democrats ran sort of a brutal smear campaign against Hoover personally, and Hoover's reputation was already hurt. So, it was a really bad election for Hoover. This concludes this section on Herbert Hoover's initial reaction to the growing Great Depression.